Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you haven't been here before, I love making videos about anything morbid or disturbing really. So you'll find videos around true crime, cults. I sometimes narrate scary Reddit stories as well. So if you're into the scary and morbid things, then you're definitely in the right place. Today we're going to be discussing a cult that lives rent-free in my brain. I heard about it quite a long time ago and I've always wanted to do a video on them. I think it's super interesting. It's not quite as scary as the Anthill Kids or like the Jonestown Massacre. Everyone pretty much knew they were in a cult, but they didn't like saying it. And one of the things that one of its followers said was, even if we are in a cult, at least it's a great cult. So anyways, but let's get into it. So in 1985, Will Allen, a Catholic-raised person who had just graduated from film school, was introduced through his sister to a very vibrant and very alternative community in Los Angeles. Will was always eager to explore life's deeper meaning, so he was very captivated by the charismatic guru from South America named Michelle. Michelle appeared to have all of life's answers. So without much hesitation, Allen agreed to join Buddhafield, which is a group that promised love and enlightenment in abundance. It wasn't until a full 22 years later that Allen realized he had been stuck in a cult. He explained that there's always someone who brings you in and introduces you, and in this case it was his sister. So having her there made him feel safe and as if nothing was really wrong with being part of this beautiful community who had great and very smart, very normal people in it. He explained that because one of his family members had joined, everyone already felt like a friend and someone he could trust. When he walked into Buddhafield, they basically had a chair set aside for him with his name on it already. This community offered a chance for people to get closer to God, and it was made up of a group of like-minded people devoted to a drug, alcohol, and sex-free lifestyle. Although that all sounds wonderful to someone who thrived on that kind of lifestyle, it did mask much darker behaviors, from threatening followers with expulsion if they didn't get an abortion to holding weekly private hypnotherapy sessions that later turned into years of sexual abuse. For many of its young male followers, this is the Buddhafield cult. So I just want to speak a little bit about the cult leader. Michelle, whose real name was actually Jamie Gomez, came to America hoping to become a movie star. He even played a very small part in Rosemary's Baby, but when acting didn't work out, Michelle found a new role and a new passion: self-appointed prophet of Buddhafield. According to the documentary made about Buddhafield called Holy Hell.
Hi, I just quickly want to jump in here and say that Holy Hell is directed by the guy that I mentioned right at the beginning of the video, Will Allen. He was a former member of the Buddhafield cult and he was in the cult for 22 years. So I'm pretty sure that all of the footage you'll see of the cult was pretty much taken by him. So if you do want to go watch that documentary, it's super informative and shows a lot about the cult that I'll be speaking about.
Members later found out that he actually also acted in gay somethingography. Some believe that he also studied the dark arts. People were very drawn to Michelle's teachings about healing and self-fulfillment, and when people were introduced to the group, they often really quickly joined. They called him the teacher and left their old lives and old houses behind to live together in houses in the community of Buddhafield. Michelle told everyone that he actually had a master that led him to a full spiritual awakening. He spoke as if he had gone to the cosmos and come back, and he was there to tell them all about it and take them there too. He was often described as a really smart man who actually spoke 4 or 5 different languages. So people were very drawn to him because he really seemed to know what he was talking about when describing to people how to get on a path to enlightenment. If you're not sure what enlightenment is, it's described as a state of perfect knowledge or wisdom combined with infinite compassion. And it's a concept that's quite important in Buddhist teachings. To some, like survivors of trauma or people struggling with addiction, Buddhafield seemed like a place of salvation for them. Others joined to escape the pressures of society or just to fill a gap left by their religion. Most of the members worked pretty average jobs. They earned enough to pay rent in Buddhafield, and most of the leftover money would go towards building up their community and making it a much better place. These people rarely interacted with anyone outside of the group. And the group grew to around 100 people. Michelle often encouraged people to exercise and really take care of themselves. And like I said earlier, many of them joked that if it was a cult, at least it was a really good cult. So for over 20 years, many people felt very fulfilled living in Buddhafield. Michelle's energy was described as free-flowing and full of love that felt raw and unfiltered. He was never really embarrassed or apologetic, which made him very appealing to people who were struggling to feel comfortable with themselves at that point. Some of his followers really viewed him as a kind of god and stated that when he touched them, their bodies would start convulsing like a kind of energy or electricity was flowing through them. They would describe his touch as being high without any of the substances, and they truly believed that Michelle was the last step to reaching full enlightenment. Among all of this, there were a lot of red flags, like there always is. Michelle was a compulsive liar. He used words from other people's books that his followers were not allowed to read, and they were also told not to seek information outside of the group at all. But that was a spiritual bargain they made to stay close to Michelle and potentially reach enlightenment. Interestingly enough, ballet was a key part of Michelle's routine, and he forced his followers to practice it at least 3 times a week. They would put on very elaborate performances with lots of costumes, makeup, sets, and professional lighting. They rehearsed for a year, but each performance was only for themselves, not for an audience. And later on, when they eventually moved to Austin, Texas, they even built a theater for Michelle, who was an ex-ballet dancer. Alan recalls that there was a ballet show that they worked on for 2 years. They had the costumes and the 25-foot set ready, but after the dress rehearsal, they never performed it for the group. It was just ridiculous. Along with the ballet 3 times a week, sometimes the rules also got a bit more personal. Michelle would give very specific orders to certain individuals. His biggest focus was on sex, which the group later discovered in a really disturbing way, but he banned most members from having sex, saying that the energy from an orgasm was a lesser kind of high than the enlightenment he was speaking of. Michelle was often seen in just a Speedo and a pair of Ray-Bans, and he focused on bringing in very attractive young males, especially young male virgins. You'll see throughout the video, I'll be showing lots of photoshopped photos of Michelle, and these are photos that Alan took of him. Michelle was a natural in front of the camera, and Alan was very passionate about photography and film, so he often took lots of pictures of him. As Alan taught himself Photoshop to enhance the pictures, Michelle always posed with very intense stares, similar to classic movie stars like Marilyn Monroe. Michelle wore makeup on a daily basis and definitely embraced his feminine side, and he also encouraged other followers to do the same. So when people think of cults, they often imagine really morbid, strange, unhappy lifestyles mixed with religious rituals, but in Buddhafield, everything seemed very positive, and they stayed very connected to what was happening in the world. Alan said there was definitely a lot of humor and laughing in everything they did. Michelle was very funny, and everyone always laughed together all the time. People in Buddhafield would go on regular hikes and dips in the lakes nearby, and generally lived a very carefree, content life. At Buddhafield, it was all about community, loving each other, and letting go of negative energy in your life. So everyone lived together, they did yoga together, cooked together, meditated together, and attended classes with Michelle like acting and of course ballet. Some of the members even worked together. Alan, along with 2 of his friends, had short-term jobs at an Indian restaurant, and they even served celebrities like Barbra Streisand and Michael Jackson. But like all cults, there were eventually some rituals introduced. But these rituals didn't really seem like rituals. They were phrased and put in a very positive light. So for example, one of the earlier rituals that they participated in involved the Buddhafield members surrendering things they deemed negative in their life. So they would all come together in a very tight circle, and the person surrendering would be in the middle of the circle. They would just kind of say what they wanted to surrender, whether it be money or sex or old attachments to bad friends, anything really. Then the members around them would wash these things off of the person in the middle and make washing actions over them, basically. So yeah, and then that was them surrendering all the bad things in their life, and that was the ritual done. It did get a little stranger after that though. So then Michelle started telling his followers that he would have a day set aside in the week where they could come and ask him for the direct experience of God, and he called it the knowing. The knowing was based on this book called the Bhagavad Gita. I hope I'm saying that right. It's a Hindu book where Krishna reveals the direct experience of God to his disciple Arjuna. And this knowing God and experiencing him was something a lot of the Buddhafield members were actually looking to do and felt that their life was lacking. Michelle also made sure to not let everyone receive the knowing immediately, almost as if you had to be worthy first before receiving this kind of next level spiritual experience. So his followers ended up dedicating a lot of time trying to become someone worthy of experiencing the knowing. And to just explain the kind of manipulation that went on, Michelle once told a follower that he had been up all night fighting with God, fighting for the follower's life, saying that this follower was fated to have a terrible accident. He was going to die. Michelle said that this follower needed to follow his guidance in order to survive this whole ordeal, and there was no way out of it. So when Michelle felt that people were ready to experience the knowing, he guides you up into the woods and he looks into your eyes with this open-eyed meditation that is apparently very overwhelming. He would ask you, what do you want? And then the followers would have to say that they wanted to have the knowing revealed to them. Michelle then makes you bow down. He then says to them that they will now receive the knowing and they will know God directly, and they are ready to experience this. Followers would often say that straight after this experience, something in them changed. It was like a switch, and it was like they were on an acid trip for 3 days straight. It was just this extremely euphoric, out-of-body feeling. If you do decide to watch the movie Holy Hell, there is a lot of footage of people experiencing the knowing, and you'll see. They're like crying, they're all over the place. I've never seen people not on substances that happy. It's a little creepy. Members also paid Michelle $50 for weekly hypnotherapy sessions called cleansings. This kind of therapy was called regression hypnotherapy, and you kind of would sit there and try to go back to trauma, kind of relive it and then change it so that you become empowered through this trauma that you've now relived. Michelle even gave everyone new names to help them move beyond their past and to create a new way of them seeing themselves so that they do genuinely feel cleansed after these hypnotherapy sessions. So Amy was now called Emiliana, Laurie was called Crystal, etc. And after this ritual, Michelle would tell these followers with their new names that they were to detach from their family because they are now new and they are reborn into this new person. He even stopped one of his followers from visiting her dying father because she needed to detach from her family and there was no other way to do it. Another follower's family actually ended up hiring a private investigator to look into the group because her daughter was nowhere to be seen and they just lost contact. Obviously, the family suspected it was a cult, so after the private investigator did the investigating, Michelle actually went straight to this family and told them that they're just a benign group, a non-cult, if you will. Not a cult at all. There were also followers that were called body workers that were privileged with the task of massaging Michelle and loosening up his tight muscles after all of the exercise and dancing that he had been doing. These people viewed this as a privilege and an honor to be touching this God figure in their lives. And Alan explained that over time, he actually realized Michelle was grooming men within the group. And based on his experience, Alan believed that Michelle had a very calculated plan. He wouldn't actually let anyone get tested for AIDS, claiming that the fear and the worry about the disease would actually end up causing the disease, even if someone was HIV negative. So because of this, members were forbidden from being tested and were also told not to have sex at all. So supposedly no one was having sex and no one was getting tested, when in actual fact, everyone was kind of sleeping together. And you'll later find out what Michelle's calculated plan was. One of the weirder things that Michelle would also do was he would make his followers test out plastic surgery procedures before he himself would do the surgery. The followers were just like, yeah, sure, let me go get a nose job. I'll let you know what it looks like. And people always assumed that it was just the woman getting surgery. But when Alan was asked about this, he chuckled and said it was actually the men who got most of the plastic surgery done. Michel had some of his followers get cheek implants just to see how they looked, because he might get cheek implants later in his life if he liked how they looked. He would have people get lip fillers and chin implants before he decided if he wanted to go through with it. And sometimes he even chose people who he thought needed a physical change or a bit of a glow up, which was honestly pretty ridiculous and actually rude if you think about it. He'd say things like, you need to be prettier, but everyone thought that they were just these beautiful beings created by God, so everyone did get a little bit confused when all this talk of plastic surgery was going around. But at the time, it did, on the other hand, all seem very lighthearted. It didn't feel sick or manipulative to his followers. Michel often treated everything like a game, and all of the followers just played along with it. People would just take what he said and do with it what they could and try and change their own personalities to meet all of his expectations. So members actually later found out that despite Michel's very strict rules on people not being allowed to sleep together, Michel was actually pressuring male members of the Buddhafield community to sleep with him. Followers were taught to never say no to their teacher, so all men, despite their sexuality, were convinced they were having a very spiritual experience during the cleansings and ended up sadly giving their bodies to Michel. They weren't really consenting to it, but it seemed like they were in their minds, and no one really talked about it in the community. But once this started becoming a weekly occurrence for some of the men, people started having real doubts about this loving, carefree community that they thought they were in. So remember when I spoke about the HIV and AIDS and testing and no sleeping together rule? Later, Alan actually figured out that Michel's real motive was to keep all of his chosen men clean so that they wouldn't pass anything on to him. So he was basically just lying to all of his followers and making them think that what they were doing was for their own good, when it was actually just for the good of Michel and the fact that he didn't want to get STDs and he preferred virgin men. There was even one young man who Michel kept a virgin for 20 years before finally taking his virginity, making him think it was all consensual and part of the path to enlightenment. This boy unfortunately trusted Michel, thinking this is so beautiful, he's doing this to help me, and in reality, Michel had just been manipulating him for years and years. It was around 120 men who would pay him $50 for therapy that ended up in a long string of weeks and weeks of sexual manipulation and abuse. So throughout this whole ordeal, no one actually directly challenged Michel, at least not to the knowledge of Alan. And when someone considered voicing their concerns, another member would often urge them to just focus on their spiritualism and think deep within themselves if that maybe is a mistake. Those who did actually choose to leave the group were compelled to disconnect, similar to practices in Scientology. Sometimes the current Buddhafield members were actually instructed to keep up the appearance of friendships with those who left, just to monitor them in case they contacted any of the authorities and to make sure they didn't release any internal information about the happenings of Buddhafield. Eventually, a guy called Kenny fell in love with a woman in Buddhafield, and he obviously couldn't be with her because he wasn't part of the cult. So he made it his ultimate mission to tear down the cult, and he even got Cult Awareness Network involved to try and tear it all down. Michel's biggest and ultimate fear was that Buddhafield was going to be publicly referred to as a cult. So when all of this happened in the middle of the night, he grabbed 3 or 4 of his followers, and Alan was included in this, and said that they were leaving. He couldn't focus on his work in this very unstable, very negative environment that he was now put in. The other members of the cult were kind of just ditched and left there and told to wait to see where they needed to go next. But all of these people didn't want to go a day without being with Michel, so it ended up being quite a traumatizing experience for some of the people that were following him. So Michelle and the 3 or 4 chosen people were on the road for a whole 6 months trying to find a place for the Buddhafield community to settle down. They eventually chose Austin, Texas, and Michelle actually then changed his name to Andreas and brought everyone in the group to the new Buddhafield. Another thing that sparked this whole shift in the community and for Michelle to change his name to Andreas was the FBI raiding David Koresh's cult in Texas in 1993. The standoff ended in a huge fire, sadly killing 76 members of the Branch Davidians. After this, the Buddhafield group's support for each other kind of grew, but something changed in the original members. For those who had been there from the start, Andreas kind of shifted from trying to bring enlightenment to just keeping the group going. And I think this was just because he was so fearful of all of the practices being exposed and obviously his whole calculated plan falling apart. Andreas started to believe that he was a Christ-like figure, and history shows that most people who think that way end up dead. Members had to kind of start finding their own positivity. Many were at Andreas' service, getting little sleep, but always expected to stay alert at his beck and call. One follower even made him very fancy fruit salads every morning, even though Andreas mostly threw them away. He didn't even eat them. And Alan, who lived with Andreas for 18 of the 22 years that he was in the cult, became like a personal servant to Andreas. He was reading to him and tucking him into bed every night. So Andreas, who some members now called My Lord, had his Howard Hughes-like demands met every single time. When this whole thing started happening, Andreas's original followers began to question him, asking when everything became about him and not anymore about everyone's spiritual journey. In 2006, a former member of Buddhafield returned after a 10-year absence. Unlike some of the current followers, he quickly noticed all of the changes in Michelle/Andreas. He was no longer just a teacher to these people's spiritual awakening. He was now a master, and a very overly particular one at that. This returnee also soon heard from his friends that Andreas was a sexual predator. Before this former member left again, he actually sent an email to the group detailing all of the abuse allegations that some of the males had been speaking about, prompting a lot more victims to come forward than they originally thought. This led to a very gradual unraveling of the entire Buddhafield community. Some members of Buddhafield had already started considering leaving. For instance, Alan, who had been financially supported by the group, secured a job in 2003 to save up in case he decided to leave. And I'm guessing at this point, he was ready to leave. Most members actually faced a very tough journey if they did want to start anew, so they didn't immediately flee upon hearing about Andreas's misconduct. Even those who had been victims of his misconduct didn't quit right away. Some of them even denied the allegations altogether, hoping to shield the teacher. Buddhafield experienced a very slow but steady exodus as people began to accept that they were actually part of a cult. Meanwhile, Andreas relocated to Hawaii, forming a new Buddhafield community. Some of his loyal followers went with him, but most of the original followers left, and he supplemented his group with Hawaiian locals that still remain devoted to him today. Now charging $100 for therapy sessions, Andreas has secured both his financial and personal needs, so he just carries on as normal while all of these poor traumatized people have to now start healing. Now lots of displaced Buddhafield members like Alan struggle to rebuild their lives with very few job skills, very low income, and very deep emotional issues and trauma. Legal action has been quite complicated, and Alan hoped that the film he released, Holy Hell, will shed light on the very dark aspects of Andreas's behavior, and he wanted to get it shown in Hawaii. Andreas had hidden enough of his own actions to avoid legal trouble, and he made sure that most of his sexual encounters appeared to have some kind of consent. They could pursue civil cases for harassment or coercion, but lots of the former members wonder if it's even worth the time and expense. At the time, Alan and some of the other former members were in their 50s and had to restart their lives. They felt like gypsy 20-somethings trying to build careers, explore relationships, and learn to be independent adults. Some of the former members' partners left them when they decided to leave Buddhafield, and even very close friends of 17 to 20 years refused to talk to them. Alan was actually one of the people who followed Andreas to Hawaii, and he spoke a little bit about his journey after he had followed him. When he got to Hawaii, many of his friends left the group and he saw how Andreas had hurt them. He realized that his friends were reclaiming their power and their sense of right and wrong, so he decided that he couldn't stay there anymore and felt very free when he let go of all of his obligations to Andreas, but it did take him a long time to reach that point. So Alan never actually planned to make a movie about this whole thing. It wasn't until he attended the Sundance Film Festival in 2012, 4 years before the film was shown, that he felt very encouraged to share his story. The trauma specialist he was with urged him to introduce himself and become a filmmaker. At that moment, he decided to create his own film, but it took years for him to actually get to that decision. When asked about Andreas, Alan mentioned that it was rumored he had already seen the movie shortly after its release. He explained that there were whispers that someone recorded it so that Andreas could hear what was said and find a way to dispute it, of course. Andreas ended up making a statement about the film, saying it was a work of fiction meant to create drama and fear. He expressed sadness over how former friends had become angry and wished him well, claiming he was sorry if his actions caused their pain. Disgusting actions at that. Of course they caused pain. Alan then shared that the film was shown at the Honolulu Film Festival, where it was sold out on the first night. While Alan still deeply cared for the original people in the group when he joined, he didn't really consider them friends anymore. He referred to them as family, but explained that communication had kind of stopped once they left the group because they were all just very focused on starting their lives again. Alan revealed that since the film had begun to be shown in Hawaii, many people have left the group. He estimated that about 20 to 40 new people had left, especially those who were recruited locally and had never been part of the Austin, Texas group. He explained that a very small percentage of those who had originally joined him were still with Andreas, forming a new group that recruited new members. All of the people who had left the group felt very relieved after seeing the film because it confirmed their suspicions about the group and made them feel that their reasons for leaving were 100% justified. The film was then made available on iTunes and Amazon, allowing lots of people in Hawaii to watch it, but many were actually afraid to attend the theater due to concerns about being targeted by the group, and those concerns were right. But Alan respected their need for privacy and protection, but felt relieved that some people had chosen to leave. He also discussed a very troubling incident involving one of the film's characters, Murti Hawa, who was actually assaulted shortly after the Sundance Film Festival. She received death threats related to the film, and the police were investigating the situation. The person who threatened Murti had a connection to Andreas, which made Alan believe that Andreas was behind all of the hostility. So even while being released of all ties from the group, Andreas still indirectly harmed these people, and who knows if it will ever stop. The cult still continues in Hawaii today, often recruiting people through yoga classes that Andreas facilitates. So yeah, this story was quite a roller coaster of emotions. Please let me know what you think about it in the comments down below, or if you have heard of any insane cults that you would like me to speak about. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, and if you enjoy this kind of content, please don't forget to subscribe. But I will see you next week. I hope you have a beautiful week.